You're listening to audio from the Decidedly podcast. For more information, find us on Instagram at Decidedly Podcast.
Dr. Emily Oster. Dr. Oster is a well-respected economics professor at Brown University and researcher. She's done some really groundbreaking work on delving into the statistics for motherhood, raising infants, raising babies, and growing a family. She's helped people make a lot of really great decisions as they navigate their lives through those transitions. She's also been all over the news lately with her unique take on COVID research. She has a knack for parsing through the data and finding the truth in it. So today, we're really excited to talk to Dr. Emily Oster. I'm Sanger Smith with Sean Smith. This is Decidedly. Neither Sean nor I are currently or expecting children. You talked about how you moved or decided to write this book, right? Decided to write Expecting Better was your first book, right?
Yeah.
And what was fascinating to me was that you saw all these rules with pregnancy, all these rules from doctors or from people that would say, yeah, okay, don't drink caffeine, don't drink alcohol. Once you get 35, you're not going to be fertile anymore. All these like hard and fast black and white things. And you decided to question all of them. So I'm sure that some of that is your personality.
You think?
Right?
Yeah, just a little bit. A little bit.
Some of that is just who you are. But how do people who aren't that analytical, how can they make better decisions in other areas of life where they can't rely on someone who did all the work that you did for them?
I mean, I think that, there are some basic decision-making principles that I think that people can use even when they are not, when you are not going to be able to sort of dig into the data, right? If I sort of think about the pieces of kind of how I analyze these problems, there's the piece of them that's like, let me read the literature, let me really use the statistical training that I have to really understand the nuances of the data. But then there's also a piece that's just like, let me think about how to structure this decision. Let me think about, what are the trade-offs here? Let me even think about what the decision is before I dive into that. And that piece doesn't mean it requires a particular kind of sort of training your brain, but it doesn't require any particular statistical training or anything like that. And I think that's the piece where I try to tell people, that's actually a lot of what's in the new book, is sort of trying to help people think about, okay, what's the right process for these decisions? How would you think about what are the costs? What are the benefits? How do we trade those off? I think the other thing that I often tell people is like, sometimes somebody will tell you something and it seems crazy, and it might be crazy. Like, people, when they're like, some of these things people will tell you, like, if you have even one sip of coffee, like your baby could turn out with, like a weird birthmark. Like, that's not true. And you shouldn't and it sort of wouldn't matter what information you get about that. Like, that's definitely not true.
Sure.
And so there's a little bit of a piece here about kind of using your priors and saying, well, is that plausible? Like, is it really likely
that even
the
make
day I
sense?
turn 35,
yeah,
everything goes to pot? Like, are there other biological processes that work like that? No? Okay, well, probably it isn't this one either. And I think that's the sort of key to some of this stuff.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I realized for myself reading this, which hopefully I get to use all of these decision points later in life, but as of right now, it's not it's not particularly relevant. But I think I realized that I'm a rule breaker at heart anyway, right? And so I realized that there are a lot of rules that need to be broken, but also rules are a natural consequence of, in my opinion, having to disseminate information to a large group of people.
Yes.
And I wanted to hear what you thought. Do you think that's why we get all these rules?
Yes.
Or we get rules for some other reason?
Yeah, I think that's like such a good point. And yes, I think that's right. I think there's a huge value when you're conveying guidelines to people in being able to convey something simple. And there are good reasons for that, right? Like you don't, when you tell somebody, I don't know, like what's the right, like, I'm trying to think about an example that's not out of this, but think about something like BMI, right? We have these cutoffs for being overweight, and the cutoff for being overweight is a BMI of 25. Now, there's a reason to have a cutoff there. Partly it's because, then you can kind of convey something to people. It just sort of gives you some language to use to explain maybe you should go on a little bit of a diet. It's also good for tracking. So a lot of these kind of rules kind of accrue because we want to be able to say over time, what's the share of the US population with some feature. And so we need to define what that feature is. And, so we pick some natural cutoff. I think the problems come when we then use those as if they mean something. Right. So sometimes you'll kind of make a rule, and then even though the rule itself was just some sort of arbitrary number, people will start treating it like it's special, like it's a sort of like the moment that your BMI is 25.1, like immediately you're tremendously unhealthy. Whereas if it was 24, you're fat. Yeah. Right. Now you're fat, and we know being fat is terrible. And 24.9, then you're a skinny person. Do not worry about that. It's like, well, that's not really that can't be right, and yet we sort of treat it like that. And actually this sometimes has really serious consequences. So there's some very nice research when you talk about birth weight for babies. There's a cutoff at 1,500 grams, which is defined as very low birth weight if you're below that. And so actually there's some research that shows that babies that are just under that, 1,499 grams, get much more extensive care than babies that are just over that, because they're classified in this other group, even though that number was just, again, sort of picked so we could have we had to have the line
be somewhere.
Exactly. You have to put the line somewhere.
It's important to have, these heuristics or rules of thumb that we have in medical fields and in the financial services fields. They're important, I think, for conveying concepts, giving people guidelines for, sort of general type of advice. I have a question. When you hear all of these sort of rules of thumb, like you were just talking about, how do you know which ones are things you ought to be questioning? You talked about, if it sounds crazy, but so many people don't have the either wherewithal to research. They don't have time to research. It's not their personality. How do we know when things are something we ought to be taking into consideration? Because a lot of the BS that comes to us from the internet, if I Google something, it comes from what seems to be a fact-based position. I mean, it sounds like it might be real, but turns out it's not. How do we know the difference?
I think one thing to say is it's almost never the case that anything that has a sharp cutoff is actually different on either side of the cutoff. Right. So if somebody says if your credits, if that's actually not always true, but from almost anything that's a sort of like a process of some type, it isn't going to be the case that when this number goes above 6, something special happens that didn't happen that was, when it was 5.9. And so the question is, in some way, sort of what should you take from information like this? So what should you sort of take from these trends? How, that there's something you would learn, which is higher values of this, maybe worse in some way. But translating that into you care specifically about the cutoff, I think that's where we kind of get into, into problems, and where it's very rare that there's something like that where the cutoff really matters. Even things like credit scores, right? People use, in the financial space, people use credit scores to decide, if your credit score is below X, we're not giving you a loan. Well, that means that the people with the credit scores just above X are more likely to get a loan, but they're actually not really very different than the people credit scores just below X. And, on average, people with higher credit scores are going to pay you back more, but just because their credit score is 601 and not 599, doesn't actually mean that much.
Mm-hmm. Sure. People like those rules, though. People like to have the conclusion be given to them, I think. You said earlier, you said don't Google stuff to figure out the decision. Man, that's how I'm making most of my decisions. That's how I'm figuring most things out. I started training for a triathlon. I'm going to do an Ironman in 2021. I've never done a triathlon. I did a triathlon as a 12-year-old that was like probably totaled 3 miles, which is, it was nothing.
It's a few more miles for the Ironman.
Okay, it's a little bit longer.
A little longer.
I'm not a runner. I'm not a cyclist. I'm not a swimmer.
Sounds like a great plan. I don't see what could go wrong.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll all be fine. But in the process, I wanted to figure out all of these things about triathlon. I wanted to figure out all these things about eating healthy, about working out. And I've learned a lot. But what I've done is I'm searching for other people to have drawn a conclusion that I can go just extract. Like, I want to go find a trainer that has told me how to get faster at running. And I do that. What is the best training plan? And that's what I was looking for, because I can't get that tailored one-on-one coaching. What I could, but I'm just not doing it.
But you're cheap. You don't want to buy it.
Yeah,
I'm pay cheap for stuff. Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I mean, I think, people like to be told what to do. And there are circumstances in which actually that's probably good, because it may well be the case that there's many good ways to train for a triathlon. And really, you just need to like pick one and stick to it. And so in a sense, like, it's good to have someone just tell you, this is the plan. There's 50 possible plans, but you just got to pick one. I mean, this is what child discipline is like. The main thing is there's a lot of different good ways to do this. You can have the warnings, you can have the this, you can have the that. The main thing is pick something where you've decided on a set of consequences and then do that every time. And that's the thing people respond to. It doesn't matter if it's a reward with a cookie or a punishment or a time, like just like something where there's a consistency and it happens every time. That's the key thing. So in some sense, like, people like to be told, I mean, adults are like this too. It's why these kind of diets work that have like strict rules, right? Because people have a hard time with vagary. But if you just tell them your diet is don't eat bread, okay, at least they understand what that is.
Yeah, you lose me when you start talking about macros and weighing things, and you got to have
count the points. What is it? Just like have some rule. Don't eat cookies. If I want to lose weight, just like don't eat cookies, don't eat bread. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I can't do it, but I do understand what it is. I can't follow through.
Well,
you're not following any of them, but they make sense. Yeah.
They make sense.
No, that's funny. Yeah, people really like the rules, but it has a negative consequence in that they become the Bible, all of these different rules. I talk about that in finance with clients. Like, people come with all of these rules that some of them I've never even heard before, but they will approach the conversation as if it is the rule. And maybe it's, I've got to distribute X% from my portfolio, or I've got to have this amount of money in stocks, or I shouldn't spend more than this amount of my income on housing. And people get frustrated when the answer is, every single time, the answer from me is, it depends. It depends.
People do not like that.
Yeah, nobody likes that.
No, and I mean, the financial stuff is really interesting, because you sort of think about these rules that people tell you when you're budgeting. Like, okay, if you want to sort of stick to a budget, you should have categories, right? You should have like, this is your envelope with the food money, and this is your leisure envelope, and this is your this, and you shouldn't like take money out of the gas envelope, put it in the leisure envelope, because like that's a mistake. And of course, for economists, it's like, well, money's fungible. Like, all money is all the same. So then what do you mean there's like leisure money? But of course, people behave as if there's leisure money. And also it sort of has this value. So there's like a little bit of a tension there about, there's something that's good about the rules, but not if you imbue them with significance that they do not have.
Sure.
Yeah, I thought it was, it was interesting when some of the questions that we wrestle with as financial advisors. A lot of times people want to boil it down to the mathematical answer. And many times the mathematical answer is not where the advice really needs to come from. It needs to come from, well, how much, utility do you get out of making this decision? One of them that comes to mind a lot is, should I pay off my house? Or should I take this lump sum and invest it? And maybe I'll make more money by investing it than I will by paying off my house. Well, maybe that's true. But if your values are around freedom from debt and peace of mind, and you don't want to have to worry about this, maybe the right decision for you is not the mathematical answer. Mm-hmm. Maybe it is, maybe we should just pay this off and you can just be done with it. And you brought up one of the things about having parents who work, right? So, and I liked how you went through that, because it's a question I get about, should this person